When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the world saw the end of a devastating war. But behind the scenes, across factories, research labs, hidden bunkers, and remote test sites, something else was ending: Japan's wartime weapons programs. Projects that had absorbed enormous resources. Projects that were kept so secret that many Japanese civilians did not know they existed. Projects ranging from advanced aircraft to biological warfare to experimental submarines. These programs did not simply disappear on the day of surrender. Some were destroyed deliberately. Some were dismantled by American occupation forces. Some were buried in forests and mountains. And some disappeared into the hands of the Allies, who wanted to learn exactly what Japan had been building, and whether any of it could be useful in the new geopolitical world that was forming. So today we are diving deep into one of the least understood parts of Japan's wartime history. What happened to Japan's secret weapons programs after the war? What did the Americans find? What did Japan try to hide? And how did these programs shape both the occupation and the emerging Cold War? Let's start with the moment Japan surrendered, a sudden end to wartime research. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Tokyo's scientific and military communities were thrown into chaos. Laboratories that had been operating at full speed suddenly had to shut down. Researchers who had been working on classified projects were told to destroy documents. Equipment had to be hidden, buried, burned, or dismantled. Japan had dozens of secret programs, but only a handful were truly advanced or strategically important. These included 7 experimental aircraft programs, Fudrankeet, and jet propulsion research, Fudintive marine and midget subprojects, Fudin military radar development, Fudin naval superweapons, including giant submarines, findy biological and chemical weapons programs. Early guided torpedoes and bombs. These projects represented years of work by thousands of scientists, engineers, and military officers. Many believed that if Japan could produce even one technological breakthrough, it might change the direction of the war. Instead, all of it came crashing down within days. As American forces prepared to enter Japan, the orders became clear: destroy anything that might reveal the full scale of Japan's war research, burn documents, sink prototypes, make sure nothing dangerous or incriminating fell into Allied hands. But the Americans arrived faster than expected. The arrival of the Americans and the race to secure technology. When American troops entered Japan for the occupation, they immediately sent specialized teams to investigate Japan's technological and scientific capabilities. Engineers, intelligence officers, and researchers fanned out across the country to identify labs, factories, bunkers, and test facilities. Their mission was simple: find everything, document everything, and remove anything that might help the United States or prevent information from falling into Soviet hands. Many civilians had no idea what these teams were looking for. To them, a hidden research lab was just another warehouse or factory. But intelligence officers knew exactly what they were doing. They had studied aerial photos, captured documents, and reports from the war. What they discovered surprised even them. Let's begin with one of the most ambitious programs Japan pursued: Japan's advanced aircraft programs. During the war, Japan struggled to keep up with American aircraft production. But Japanese designers were working on planes that could compete with or surpass Allied technologies. The most famous of these was the Kyushu J-7W Shinden, a canard-style interceptor designed to shoot down B-29 bombers. It had a radical forward canard layout and was intended to reach high speeds. Only a single prototype ever flew, and only for a few minutes. But when American investigators found it, they realized it represented a major leap in Japanese aeronautical design. The Shinden was shipped to the United States for analysis. Engineers studied its structure, materials, and aerodynamic concept. It never entered service, but it influenced American understanding of alternative aircraft configurations. Another major area was jet propulsion. Japan had several jet programs at various stages of development. The Nakajima Kicker, for example, was Japan's first jet aircraft. It was loosely inspired by the German Me-262, but it had a smaller airframe and simpler design. Only 2 prototypes were built, and only one flew before the surrender. The Americans captured the prototypes and technical documents and sent them to the United States. The research itself did not directly influence American jets, which were already advancing rapidly, but it gave engineers a clear picture of how far Japan had gotten. The real value came from what was missing. Documents had been burned. Test data had been destroyed. Some researchers refused to speak. The Americans realized that many Japanese scientists feared war crimes charges, or they wanted to protect their work. Eventually, most of these aircraft programs were dismantled. Prototypes were shipped out. Factories that built components were repurposed for civilian use. Aviation engineers were banned from designing military aircraft, which pushed many into automotive or electronics fields. This shift would eventually help shape Japan's post-war industrial boom. But aircraft were only part of the story. Japan had built some of the most unusual submarines of the war. Japan's submarine superweapons. One of Japan's boldest secret weapons was the I-400 class submarine, the largest submarines in the world at the time. These massive vessels were designed to carry attack aircraft that could be launched mid-ocean. The goal was to strike strategic targets like the Panama Canal. 3 I-400 subs were completed before the war ended, but none launched a combat attack. When Japan surrendered, American forces immediately took interest. These submarines were unlike anything the U.S. Navy had ever seen. The U.S. seized the submarines and sailed them to Hawaii for inspection. Engineers studied their air launch systems, storage hangars, and compressed air catapults. But then something unexpected happened. After studying the subs, the U.S. Navy sank every one of them. Not because they were dangerous, but because the United States did not want the Soviet Union to gain access to their technology. The Cold War had already begun, even before the occupation ended. Aside from these giant subs, Japan had an extensive program of midget submarines, human torpedoes, and advanced underwater weapons. These programs were dangerous, sometimes desperate, and involved some of the most extreme wartime tactics. After the war, the Americans dismantled these programs completely. Some midget subs were preserved for study, others were scrapped. But the submarine programs were not the most secretive or controversial part of wartime research. That title belonged to something far darker: biological and chemical weapons programs. During the war, Japan operated biological and chemical weapons programs under organizations such as Unit 731, Unit 100, and several related units. These programs developed anthrax, plague, cholera, and dozens of other pathogens. They conducted human experimentation, field testing, and mass research. As the war ended, Japan attempted to erase these programs completely. Buildings were burned. Bodies were buried or destroyed. Documents were shredded. Scientists fled their posts. When American investigators reached the sites, they found ruins, empty buildings, and scattered fragments of research. But they also found scientists who were willing to talk under the right conditions. The American occupation faced a moral and strategic decision. The Soviet Union was also interested in Japan's biological research. To prevent the research from falling into Soviet hands, American intelligence made a controversial choice. They offered immunity to key scientists in exchange for their data. This meant that instead of being prosecuted for war crimes, several Unit 731 researchers were allowed to return to civilian life. They provided detailed information on experiments, pathogens, production methods, and test results. It was a morally troubling decision, and the legacy of that choice is still debated today. For Japanese civilians, the existence of these programs was deeply shocking. Most had never heard of Unit 731 or the details of biological warfare. The secrecy was so intense that even many government officials did not know the full extent of the work. After the occupation began, the program sites were dismantled permanently. Buildings were bulldozed. Equipment was confiscated or destroyed. The scientists re-entered society quietly, and the topic was almost completely absent from public discussion until decades later. But even outside the realm of biological warfare, Japan had been working on advanced weapons systems that sound almost futuristic. Experimental rockets and guided weapons. Japan developed several rocket and guided weapon prototypes during the war. Though they were far behind German progress in technologies like the V-2, these included experimental solid fuel rockets, air-to-air and air-to-surface guided bombs, air-by-surface-to-air rockets intended to defend against B-29 attacks, early attempts at ramjets and pulse jets. Most of these projects were in early development. Japan did not have the resources or time to field them. When the Americans arrived, they found scattered test facilities, unfinished prototypes, and partially assembled rockets. American intelligence teams collected these materials, interviewed researchers, and compared Japanese progress to German and American rocket developments. Most of the material was judged to be technologically interesting but not revolutionary. Once the research was documented, the programs were shut down entirely. Japan was prohibited from developing rockets or missiles for decades after the war. Many researchers moved into civilian industries, contributing to Japan's eventual success in electronics and engineering. However, the end of the war did not stop interest in Japan's pre-war and wartime technology. The Americans were not the only ones looking closely. The role of the Soviets. As the occupation began, the Soviet Union was extremely interested in Japan's military research. Soviet troops had invaded Manchuria in the final days of the war. They captured several research facilities and took Japanese scientists to the Soviet Union. This included Subi rocket engineers, Fudi aircraft technicians, Soviological researchers, IT biological researchers, and industrial scientists. Some were kept as prisoners. Others worked under supervision in Soviet labs. The Americans understood this and made sure to secure key sites before the Soviets could get to them. The sinking of the I-400 submarines was one example. Another was the rapid collection of biological research. The competition between the US and the USSR shaped what happened to Japan's weapons programs. Each side wanted information, but neither wanted the other side to gain too much. For Japanese civilians, these international rivalries were invisible. They were dealing with hunger, rebuilding, and surviving the occupation. They had little idea how their country's wartime research was being divided up by global powers. Meanwhile, the Americans had another problem to address: weapons stockpiles and secret caches. Throughout Japan, the military had hidden weapons in tunnels, caves, basements, and warehouses. Some were hidden to support a last stand. Others were buried to avoid confiscation. Civilians sometimes stumbled upon these caches after the war. These caches included self-didactic weapons, self-didactic munition, feindliche Tempain artillery grenades and explosives, feindliche prototype weapons, fight-age materials. The American occupation forces undertook massive campaigns to find and destroy these stockpiles. In some areas, soldiers went door to door. In others, they relied on civilian reports. Destroying these caches was not simple. Many were located in hard-to-reach areas. Some were booby-trapped. Others were deteriorating and dangerous. For civilians, the discovery of buried weapons was sometimes frightening, but it also symbolized the end of the militaristic era. Japan's weapons were disappearing, piece by piece. While caches were being cleared, the Americans focused on another important goal: ensuring that Japan's scientific talent was redirected toward peaceful industries. The fate of Japanese scientists and engineers. One of the most important changes after the war was what happened to Japan's scientific community. Many wartime researchers feared punishment, but the American occupation soon realized that Japan's scientific and engineering knowledge could be valuable for rebuilding the country. Instead of punishing all researchers, the occupation authorities created paths for them to enter civilian industries. Former aircraft engineers joined companies like Mitsubishi and Toyota. Naval engineers moved into shipbuilding. Electronics researchers joined NCC and Toshiba. Chemists and physicists entered pharmaceuticals and manufacturing. In this way, Japan's wartime research culture evolved into a peacetime industrial powerhouse. The skills honed during the war found new homes in factories, universities, and research institutes. This shift played a major role in Japan's post-war economic miracle, but the American oversight of research was strict. Japan was prohibited from developing military aircraft, rockets, missiles, or advanced weapons for many years. This forced Japan's brightest minds to focus on peaceful technology. It changed the direction of Japanese innovation forever. The dismantling of Japan's military-industrial complex during the occupation. Entire research institutions were shut down. The Japanese military had controlled vast networks of facilities, many of which were located in rural or suburban areas. These included testing ranges, laboratories, naval arsenals, and aviation yards. To prevent Japan from ramming, the occupation ordered complete dismantling of these facilities. Machinery was taken apart. Furnaces were shut down. Runways were demolished. Buildings were repurposed or torn down. For civilians, this meant job loss in the short term, but long-term opportunity. Many of these facilities later became university campuses, industrial parks, or civilian factories. Research towns that had once been focused on weapons development became centers for science, engineering, and education. In this sense, the end of Japan's secret weapons programs eventually helped build the foundation of modern Japanese science and industry. But the most controversial question remained: what happened to the weapons themselves? Weapons destruction and disposal. During the occupation, millions of weapons were destroyed, guns were melted down, ammunition was dumped into the sea, artillery pieces were cut apart, explosives were detonated. The process was systematic. US engineers oversaw disposal. Japanese civilians and former soldiers often assisted in the work. Some of the disposal created environmental issues that lingered for decades. Chemical weapons, for example, were sometimes buried or dumped in the ocean. In a few cases, fishermen later found rusted barrels filled with toxic chemicals. But the goal was clear. Japan would not be a military threat again. There were exceptions. Certain captured equipment was preserved for study. Some weapons were sent to US museums or testing grounds. A few were displayed publicly during the occupation as part of demilitarization campaigns. By the early 1950s, the vast majority of Japan's wartime weapons had been destroyed. Only a handful of prototypes, documents, and artifacts survived. But the legacy of Japan's secret weapons programs did not end with their destruction. The influence carried forward in ways many civilians never realized. Impact on the Cold War and post-war Japan. The information Japan provided to the Americans influenced US military research in subtle ways. Biological and chemical data, aerospace concepts, metallurgy techniques, and underwater weapons designs were analyzed and compared to German and American programs. This knowledge, combined with captured German technology, shaped early Cold War research across multiple fields. For Japan, the end of secret weapons programs created a blank slate. The country had to rebuild from zero. Instead of focusing on militarism, Japan invested in education, technology, manufacturing, and infrastructure. Former military labs became universities. Weapons researchers became engineers and designers. The same technical culture that once powered secret weapons programs eventually powered Japan's transformation into a global leader in technology and industry. This dramatic shift was only possible because the secret weapons programs ended so completely. The occupation dismantled the old system and replaced it with one that emphasized peace, stability, and economic growth. The transition was difficult. Many scientists lost their careers. Many civilians were unaware of what had been built in the first place. But in the long run, the end of Japan's secret weapons programs helped create a foundation for reconstruction and prosperity. When we look back at Japan's wartime secret weapons programs, it is easy to focus on the prototypes, the engineering achievements, or the dramatic secrecy. But what happened after the war is even more important. These programs were dismantled with a thoroughness rarely seen in history. The research was analyzed, preserved, or destroyed. The scientists were redirected. The facilities were repurposed, the weapons themselves vanished. Japan moved from a militaristic empire to a peaceful nation, and the end of these secret programs played a central role in that transformation. These weapons never changed the course of the war, but their disappearance changed the course of Japan.